Listeners, law firm positioning and branding is a hot topic as the legal industry consolidates. My guest today is the Chief Strategy Officer of a uniquely positioned elite corporate law firm in disputes and investigations. Get ready to take notes and learn from a law firm outsider. Enjoy. So, welcome, Gary, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Great to be here, Chris.
Gary, I had the pleasure of hearing you speak at Columbia Business School with Professor Ron Kivitz for marketing, and he brought in the Chief Strategy Officer of Kobre Kim, and I'm like, this is amazing. And I got to hear just some wonderful content and things that I love talking about, strategy and brands. So would love for you to share a little bit about how you got into strategy and brands, and why do you like it? Why do you do this?
Oh, great. Well, and thank you for the compliment at Columbia. Been doing that for over 40 years. So when I was an undergraduate, which is when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, and I became very involved in both the student newspaper, and then as a result of that, actually started a graphic design company with employing design students from the university. And so from there, I went to business school. I went to the University of Chicago. And when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up, I used the model of my company, and that led me into advertising. And so I started, for the first 24 years of my career, I was account guy at an agency, for most of it at Leo Burnett, and my last role there was the global head of Kraft Foods. And then I went on from there to another agency where I ran a geographic office.
That's amazing. So you wrapped up your role at Leo Burnett as global head of Kraft Foods.
Yep.
That was the account, that was the client.
Right.
And then you moved on to a number of different roles, and I'm just going to name them off for my listeners. You were at Darcy you had a significant role there. You were at McKinsey as a partner. You were at Interbrand, another company called Biology, a place called Redline Results, I believe, which I'm sure you'll define.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're at A.T. Kearney for a number of years. And now you're at Kobre Kim, an elite law firm, and a professor at Columbia Business School. Share a little bit of our journey of you being this advertising brand strategist consultant.
Yeah, so Darcy, I ran an office. So I went from running an account to sort of becoming a little bit more focused on the business. And in many of those instances that you talked about, it was either creating something or turning something around. And I can come back to that as you're interested.
Yeah.
But the really cool thing about Burnett is, at the time, we were a pretty important resource for marketing of our clients' businesses. In many cases, our clients didn't have independent marketing departments, or they were just building independent marketing departments. Yeah. And so we were interfacing primarily with salespeople, and we were providing the marketing thinking. As the product management industry matured, agencies became more and more focused on the creative side, and a little less focused on the strategy side. And so that's when I decided that I didn't feel like I had continued to have a big enough seat at the table. And so made the switch to McKinsey as a partner, as a direct elect partner in the New York office focused on financial service institutions. And there, the idea was the intersection of kind of the creative thinking that I had done at an agency and the linear analytic part of me, that came from places like University of Chicago.
I know I'm dying to have you share this story with Altoids, and when you shared it in class, I was mesmerized, as well as all my classmates. And could you Could you tee this up for my listeners to understand the dynamics, the situation, and how you got pulled into this?
Yeah. So Kraft acquired a company in Europe called Jacob Suchard, which was the leading coffee marketer across Europe. And as part of that acquisition, and I don't know that this is literally true, but I like to say they probably didn't even know that it was part of that acquisition. There was this tiny little confection company called Callard and Bowser, which was located in White Plains, New York. And the business that Callard and Bowser was in was identifying all these really high-end confections made in Europe and importing them into the US. And within that portfolio was this tiny little brand called Altoids. At the time, Kraft Foods was owned by Philip Morris. Jeff Bible was the CEO of Philip Morris. And for some reason, Jeff was poring over the Kraft portfolio, and he noticed this little brand called Altoids. We sold about 6 of them, so there was no volume. But what distinguished it for Jeff is it was pretty much the only thing in the entire Kraft Foods portfolio that had the same margin as cigarettes.
Wow.
Your listeners may or may not know that packaged foods are generally relatively low margin items that you sell a lot of. And cigarettes is a very high margin item. And so Jeff called up Jim Kiltz, who was the CEO of Kraft, and said, "What about Altoids?" Again, a little bit of embellishment. I doubt that Kiltz even knew what Altoids were at the time. But we were just coming off of some pretty significant successes with Kraft. And so they offered us, I can't remember if we competed for Altoids and won. I think we did. Yes, we did. Because it was the only time in my career where the creative we used to compete was actually run. So, but we were asked to compete for Altoids. It was such a small brand that it could break a lot of the normal conventions that Kraft deployed on its bigger brands.
Okay.
And the thing that's interesting about Altoids is, I think everybody's familiar with it now. It comes in a little tin, and it's a bunch of little pellets, and it's a pretty powerful mint. And financially, the tin actually costs more money than the pellets. So the most expensive part of the product is the packaging. There was some consideration of moving it to a traditional package and reducing the cost of goods. But what we did is we noticed in the data that a huge disproportionate share of Altoids' total sales, which again were very, very little, was taking place in Seattle. And Seattle, this was pre-Starbucks and all that, so there was no obvious reason why Seattle. And so what we did is we sent a guy to Seattle, and we recruited some Altoids users to figure out what was going on that it was appealing to them. And we did this strange thing, which is we had people write an obituary for Altoids. And so we recruited users, and we said, if Altoids disappeared off the earth, write its obituary. And the obituaries were truly remarkable. It was like either a very, very close relative had died or a very, very close friend. But it was somebody that was obviously meaningful to you. And they went on, and they used incredibly detailed emotional language. And then we asked the same people to write an obituary for Certs, which is a competitor.
Yeah.
And they were very perfunctory. It was kind of like, Certs died, we're going to miss them, move on. So that made us realize that there's something going on here beyond just a candy. And then the second thing that happened that was completely unplanned is the young man that we sent to conduct these focus groups was sitting at a coffee shop with a tin of Altoids at the table, just drinking coffee by himself. And multiple people came up to him and bummed an Altoid. And so a perfect stranger would come to him and say, "Hey, would you mind giving me an Altoid?" And he was smart enough to tell us that story. Yeah. So those two data points One is that people were bumming Altoids, and two was people had this incredible emotional reaction to it, led us to believe that there's something going on here that goes way beyond a mint. We called the packaging a visual billboard, a mini billboard, and it was a status brand, and so a discovery brand. So people would see your Altoids in front of you, ask you about it, and you were the cool kid who could introduce them to Altoids. So the back end of the story is, okay, now we had some clues of what was going on in Seattle. Is that exportable? And so we repeated exactly the same research in Chicago, which had virtually no Altoid sales. We recruited people who had never heard of Altoids. We gave them a tin in the lobby as they were waiting to come into the focus group. And once they were in the focus group, we repeated exactly what we did in Seattle. So brand new people to Altoids were asked to write an obituary about Altoids. And I'm amazed to this day, the obituaries were identical to the ones in Seattle.
Wow.
So it didn't rely on having a long-lasting relationship. It was an instant connection. And so what we did is launched Altoids with out-of-home only, targeting a very specific urban dweller, and it became about discovery. So as out-of-home was so that our user, who we called Dan, would notice the brand, and then he would introduce it to other people. It became the largest selling confection. It was a huge success, so much so that Kraft started caring about it. So they moved it out of Callard and Bowser and first into General Foods and eventually into Kraft and Glenview. And ultimately, it was sold eventually to Mars. And so it's now part of Mars.
I mean, is there any way to give my audience a sense of the growth of this product in the United States?
Oh, it was astronomical and it was global. So it was basically from 0 to 100 in about a year.
Yeah.
And it continued to grow pretty aggressively. And there are all sorts of ancillary stories that I won't bore you with, but we actually innovated the use of the web because nobody had ever used the web before. We didn't know what we were doing, but we created tell us your stories about what you do with your tins.
Oh, fun.
And that made some people a little uncomfortable because some people were using their tins to store illegal substances. But it created a real community of Altoids.
Yeah, such an extraordinary story, and especially the power of seeing value hidden or doing the research and the data to unlock value creation. Gary, let's step into a little bit of what, again, I think your value that you bring. What is branding, and how can we build a compelling value proposition? And I'll tee you up with a phrase that you've used, which is meaningful differentiation.
Yeah, and so brand is your unique collection of tangible and intangible benefits. And in my mind, for a brand to matter, it needs to communicate meaningful differences versus the alternative. So if brand A and brand B are identical, then the brand doesn't matter because I have the same tangible and emotional connections to both of them. So if I feel positive about Citibank and Chase, and I think they do essentially the same thing, the brand stops mattering because it's not going to be a decision point. So it's all about contrast. It's all about what makes your brand unique, and it's usually a combination of tangible things, as we do things differently than other people do, but particularly in professional services, which is what I've spent a ton of my career on and what most of your listeners are representing. It's the intangibles that start mattering. The difference between the top 6 law firms in terms of their brilliance and their track record is probably pretty subtle. So that leads to what you heard me talk about in class is, so how do you navigate those differences between you and other people in the category? And in my mind, you do that by answering 3 questions in order. So the first question you ask yourself is who? So what's the narrow target that you're going to serve? And that target may be different than the target that somebody else is serving. And so and the more precise you can be about your who, the better, because the more general you are about your who, the less likely you're going to differentiate your who from somebody else's who. The next question is the what. The what's about the who, not you. And it's what's their problem, what keeps them up at night, what's the urgent situation that they have that is worth addressing. And then the third question, and the order is important, is the why. And now you're talking about you. So how do I solve their problem uniquely versus everybody else? So why am I the best answer to that who? The mistake that, well, one, this isn't easy. Two, there aren't really that many super powerful brands out in the world.
Yeah.
And when they get successful, they're tempted to start appealing to everybody. And so then they lose their anchor, which is the who. So back to Altoids, our who was Dan. Dan was a single guy, 26 years old, lived in Chicago, worked in advertising, was unmarried, didn't have a serious relationship. And if you opened up his refrigerator, you would be lucky if there was a slice of pizza in there. And so what defined Dan was basically a college kid with resources, that he was still living sort of that college lifestyle, but now he had a job, and so he could actually get out and do some cool things. And to your point earlier, Altoids was phenomenally successful. There aren't enough Dans in the world to account for that success, but there's a little bit of Dan in all of us. And so, there's a little bit, I'm a lot older than 26 right now, but I still would like to be a college kid with resources. And that's what appealed to this broad group of people. As it's become more and more of a mass brand, I think it's losing Dan a little bit. And it's trying to appeal to everybody, and maybe losing a little bit of its magic because it's trying to appeal to everybody. So the answer to your question is the brand is what differentiates you on both an emotional and a tangible level. And the way to get there is to define an audience you want to serve, understand that audience's real problem that is relevant to them, and then to solve that problem in a way that's important to them and distinctive.
Gary, you used a phrase, adopt an outside-in view. Do you care to explain what that means to my audience?
Yeah, so when you went back through my background, essentially I've been a consultant my whole life. Be it in advertising, being a partner at McKinsey, being a partner at A.T. Kearney. The two businesses you put in there in the middle, Redline was me being a consultant on my own, and Biology was a startup that I did with some other people where we raised a couple of $1 million, lost a couple of $1 million, and built a really interesting proposition in between. So with that consulting view, I really built my entire career on an insight, which is most people start with an inside-out view. Inside out is, I know how to build a better smartphone than everybody else. Now let me go figure out who I'm going to sell that to and how I'm going to make a lot of money. It's particularly prominent in tech. Is somebody invents some kind of cool gizmo, and then they get really excited about that cool gizmo, and they basically try to find somebody. So if you use my who, what, why framework, generally it starts with the with the why, is I invented this cool gizmo. Then oftentimes it shifts to the who, which is who the hell's going to want to buy this thing. And then finally you think about the what, which is, okay, why would they buy it? What's in it for them? Mm-hmm. So I think that to be very successful, my premise is you need to marry that inside-out view with an outside-in view. And an outside-in view is what I described to you as who, what, why, is think about it from the perspective of your customer. Who is your customer? What is their problem? And then why do you solve it? And I don't argue that you have to replace the inside-out view. I argue that most people don't supplement the inside-out with outside-in. And it's incredibly powerful. It's usually very hard for people to do. In the exercise we did with class, people really, I mean, this year we had people actually personify the audience in order to get them to be grounded in the who before they went on, because people's natural tendency is to skip the who and jump right to the why, because they want to talk about themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is a great segue to your role right now at Kobre Kim. Could you provide us a quick overview of what you're up to, who the firm is, and what you guys are focused on, maybe through the lens of what you just described?
Yeah, Kobre Kim is 22 years old, was started by Michael Kim and Steve Kobre, who were former federal prosecutors. They met each other in the Southern District of New York on a huge case. And when they decided to leave the prosecutor's office and start a law firm, they made the unusual decision not to start just another law firm, but to start a firm that was quite different. And their insight was that pretty much every firm in the world, law firm in the world, has essentially the same business model. And no judgment, not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing, is they all operate pretty much the same way. And their observation was that business model left some high-value opportunities available to a specialized firm. And so they built a firm from the top down to seize those specialized opportunities. And so 80+% of our business comes from our competitors. Most of the time, we are either brought in as a co-counsel to another firm, or as a specialized replacement on things that they can't do. And to the elements of distinctiveness, we think about 3 pillars that differentiate us, and ideally it's 2 or more that would really make somebody want to come to us versus using their regular resources. And the first pillar is conflict-free, is because we have no retained clients. We can be adverse to a much broader series of clients than most firms. And so we're often brought in as conflict counsel to handle a part of the engagement that the core counsel can't handle for various reasons. The second pillar is geography. Is if you look at our geographic profile, it's much bigger than that firms our size have, and much more unusual than any firm has. And it's because one of the things we do unusually well is navigate cross-border strategies. And so we may be brought in by a core firm to handle the cross-border strategies, and they would be anchored in strategies in certain jurisdictions. And then the last pillar is essentially unique products, niche solutions. And that's typically achieved by making the walls between practices much more porous. So bringing different legal perspectives into the matter, so that we come up with broader set of ideas than may happen by other people. So that's the context of Kobre Kim. It's been hugely successful. Currently, the firm has roughly 300, 400 employees. We're in 16 markets. It's a cool place. I've been here for 8 years. Okay. Michael and Steve decided that they wanted to add this crazy role called Chief Strategy Officer. They had never done it before. At the time, it was pretty unusual for the industry. They specifically wanted somebody from outside the industry. Yeah. And they wanted somebody with the unique combination of sort of a consulting mindset and understanding service businesses. Mm-hmm. And the primary reason for that was the firm had reached a size that was bigger than the founders. So while Michael and Steve are completely involved in the business and continue to guide it, 2 people could not have the level of interaction that they did and have this firm succeed. So that was that.
So, so you mentioned about 80% of revenue, or the 80% of referrals come from other law firms, other
Yeah.
corporate law firms. Okay, very fascinating. And that was that created from the beginning, as you put it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was fascinated with you, which was the primary reason I agreed to do this podcast. But it happens that the people who are listening to this are people we care deeply about.
Yeah.
And because we don't have deep ongoing relationships, which is typically what sustains most large law firms. And because we're doing highly specialized work, I call it time-sensitive needle in the haystack, which means very few people want the needle, and they want it when they want it. The way that we generate most of our business is having broad networking with people that, when they encounter the stuff that we do, will think of us and bring us in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Is it safe to say that another part of your role, in a most loving way, that you're the no man? That strategy is defined by what you say no to? Has that been your moniker?
Well, you were paying attention, so so my typical shtick is strategy is making choices,
Yeah.
and that the hardest choice to make is the choice of what you're not going to do, because most people get tempted by situational opportunities. And so no matter what they wrote down on the paper as their strategy, the very next day something shows up that's lucrative, and they say, oh, we'll do that too. It's actually the reverse, Chris, is the reason I was attracted to Kobre and Kim is because I thought Michael and Steve had done a much better job of defining no than anybody I'd ever seen in any industry. And it was exciting to me to sort of put my mouth where my, whatever the expression is to work for an organization that actually defined itself on what it said no about. And so I think that I won't take credit for our ability to say no. I will take some partial responsibility for institutionalizing that and making it less reliant on Michael and Steve saying no, because oftentimes the natural instincts of a lawyer are counter to the things we need to be saying no to.
Mm-hmm. And Gary, you live in Connecticut, or are you in New York?
Both.
Okay.
I am a resident of Connecticut.
Okay.
Post COVID, I live in New York 3 days a week, so
Okay.
I don't do the commute anymore.
And you're a fan of the arts. What does that look like in New York for you?
I will not say no to any play anywhere.
Okay.
Plays. My happy place is Tanglewood in the Berkshires. So pretty much every year we go up there and just do every kind of culture you can. And I'm a huge fan of Lincoln Center. I actually did several projects for Lincoln Center when I was at McKinsey, one of which led to the major renovation of Lincoln Center.
That's exciting.
So somewhat undiscriminating, but any of those things is cool.
All the above. That's exciting. Anything lately that has just been blown you away here in Manhattan that you've enjoyed?
Yeah, good question. We unexpectedly went to see Hell's Kitchen and really loved it. And I'm not usually into sort of pop musicals, but we really loved that. We just saw Uncle Vanya. I'm still trying to figure it out, but it was well done.
And it had who's the gentleman? That's
Steve Carell.
Yes.
So that's the most recent. That was this weekend.
Okay. So fun. Gary, thank you so much for spending time on the show with us. How can people find you, contact you, follow you?
Probably the easiest way is LinkedIn, and I actually respond to that. And then there's always the Kobre and Kim website. So either one of those work.
Very good. And so, Gary, it's been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for your time today.
My pleasure. Thank you.